Hey everybody, Wonder Always Bored, Never Boring. Today we are going to be looking at the Dark Crystal board game from Riverhorse. Why are we looking at the Dark Crystal board game from Riverhorse? Well, a couple of reasons really. First of all, my copy of Aeronautica Imperialis hasn't turned up. 2, I've been meaning to do it for a little while. And 3, Netflix have recently released the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance television series, which is a bit of a masterpiece, and while everybody is talking about it and searching for it, I thought, hey, maybe I'll be able to get some of that sweet, sweet traffic to my channel by talking about this vaguely related product. And this is that. I guess anybody who has seen my review of Riverhorse's Labyrinth board game may wonder why I actually have the Dark Crystal in my collection, because I was not very positive about the Labyrinth game, and the Dark Crystal game is an iteration of the same core game system. For those of you who don't know, the Labyrinth board game is basically like a stripped down or simplified version of Talisman, if such a thing is possible. It does have some interesting ideas though, that I don't think were fully fleshed out, or I don't think were enough to make it into a good game, but which certainly had the glimmer of a good game. One was that it was a completely cooperative experience. All 4 players were working together to beat Jareth. And I guess the other thing is that it used a dice mechanism where you use different types of dice depending on how good you were at certain challenges. So slow characters might move by rolling a d4, while fast characters might roll a d12. Strong characters might roll a d20 when they're fighting, whereas the weak characters might only roll a d6. And that's a system that Riverhorse have actually used in quite a few products now. It's been ported over into this Dark Crystal game. They used it in their Terminator Miniatures game and a few other products as well. But that dice system does have room for some interesting things. Like, one of the things that you could do in the Labyrinth was you could team up. You could get several characters and actually move as a group. And when you did this and you had to take challenges, everybody would chuck in their dice into the tests, and then you pick the best result, so you had a much greater chance of succeeding. But because you're moving in a group, you could only ever move by the value of the slowest person in your party, because you couldn't leave them behind. So if you had 2 people who were moving on d8s but one person who was moving on a d4, you could only move on the d4, which again it's an interesting and thematic way to deal with group dynamics when you've got several heroes working together. The other thing about movement is, obviously one of the big things about Talisman, a problem of Talisman, is that it's roll and move. You roll the dice, you move left or right. That system is still very much in place in these games, but you can choose to roll a lower dice than your actual speed value. So if you can move on a d8, you can actually choose to roll a d6 or a d4 instead. So if you need to get to a specific point and you're quite close to it, you can actually improve your odds of getting there. So while it definitely felt derivative of Talisman and not as great in scope, it had a lot less adventure cards, and it just, games after a few games, they pretty much all felt the same. It did have elements that were interesting and felt like they could be evolved. And the Dark Crystal board game takes that same core system, but it does actually build on it. There are some new mechanisms here, and there's some new ways in which they've tried to incorporate the theme of the Dark Crystal into a game experience. And if I'm being honest, this isn't actually in my collection anyway. I bought this game for my wife because the Dark Crystal is one of her favourite movies of all time, just like I had previously purchased the Labyrinth for her. So this is her game anyway, and regardless of how good it is as a game, just on its sheer beauty, it's something worth having, because obviously it's using images from the movie, but you can see that we also have some rather beautiful miniatures, which we will be taking a look at in closer detail, and it also has some beautiful hand-drawn art. The miniatures and a lot of the artwork is by a person called Johnny Fraser Allen, who also did the artwork and miniatures for the Labyrinth game. And he's actually on YouTube under Tabletop Troubadour, and I suggest you look him up because he's super talented, and he seems like a genuinely nice guy as well, but he is super talented. He recently did a Kickstarter campaign where he was selling just some of the most beautiful tabletop villages you've ever seen. It was like Brian Froud art brought to life. It was, if you bought some of these buildings and put them on your tabletop, you could literally recreate the Goblin Town from Labyrinth. They're just utterly amazing and way out of my price bracket, but beautiful stuff, and I do recommend you look into that. But this intro sure has rambled on, and we're going to take a look at the Dark Crystal. We're going to talk about how it plays, and we're going to talk about whether it's worth owning. So this game is for up to 4 players, and each player has a character, a miniature. This is the Chamberlain. And you can just see what an absolutely beautiful miniature it is. The detailing is lovely, and it really does capture the look of the Skeksis from the movie. It's a really very, very nice miniature. One player will be the Gotham Master, a much bigger, chunkier miniature than the Chamberlain. And again, my wife wants me to paint these, and I want to paint them too, but my painting queue is massive and never ending and all consuming, and it just keeps getting longer. So those are the 2 villainous characters, and then of course we get Jen carrying the sliver of the Dark Crystal. And finally we get Kira, who is wearing her cape. You can just see her wings coming through the back of the cape. Of course she has wings, she's a girl. And she's carrying Fizzgig. So as you can see, there are 2 heroic characters and 2 villains. And this is something that is different from the Labyrinth game. This game is not a fully cooperative experience. In fact, it's a very interesting experience in that the Gelflings are working together. They are both attempting to find the shard of the Dark Crystal to heal the crystal and save the day. So those 2 players will work cooperatively, and they will actually have a very different game experience to the players who are controlling the Skeksis. The Skeksis are sort of working together. They want to stop the Gelflings, but they are also subject to infighting and bickering, just like in the movie. They both want to be the emperor of the Skeksis, and they will fight each other. During the game, you will fight against the other Skeksis player, and the title of emperor will switch between you depending on who has most recently suffered a defeat. And at the end of the game, if the Gelflings lose, only the Emperor wins. So having the Emperor title at the point the game is over defines you as the winner. So either the Gelflings win together, or one of the Skeksis, who is the Emperor at the time, will win. And that's quite an interesting dynamic, and it works quite well for a number of reasons, because the Skeksis players won't have to deal with threats in the environment. They don't have to deal with when they travel to locations, the Gelflings will draw adventure cards that will challenge them, and they will have threats to overcome. The Skeksis players don't have that, and in fact the Skeksis players will be drawing Minion Cards which they can use to hunt the Gelflings and attack the Gelflings. So the Gelfling players are on a more traditional sort of quest. They're looking for the location where they can find they're actually looking for the observatory so that they can find the shard of the crystal. So they are having the traditional heroic journey, overcoming challenges, whereas the Skeksis players are playing hunters. They are hunting down the Gelflings, they are trying to waylay them, they are trying to hold them off as long as possible so that time runs out and the Gelflings lose, whilst vying for power among themselves. I've not really seen anything like it in another game, and it's a very interesting concept. Of course, the Skeksis don't often like to get their hands dirty, so throughout the game they will also have the opportunity to unleash the Gotham, and unfortunately the Gotham are represented by these standees, which have very nice artwork on, but they're quite big. They take up a lot of space on the board, and they absolutely have to release a miniature pack of Gothams, because I want some miniatures of Gothams, I really do. I just think they would be amazing, and it would be an incredible wasted opportunity if they don't release some miniatures for that. And in fact, I believe there is a rumour that they have mentioned that that is something they are planning to do if the game does well enough. They have already, for their previous Labyrinth game, released 2 miniatures expansions. They released a set of the Goblins, and they've released a set of the Fireys, which also includes an alternative Jareth miniature. So it's something that they have previous for doing, so I will be expecting some Gothams at some point. But anyway, those are your characters. Let's take a look at some character sheets. So here we have the character sheet for Skeksil, the Chamberlain, and you can see we have 3 values here. We have speed, wit and brawn, and values here determining which kind of dice you roll when making a test for each of those abilities. So you'll be rolling a d6 for speed because he's not very fast, you'll be rolling a d12 for wit because he is clever, he is cunning, and you'll be rolling a d8 for brawn because he is a threat but he is not a combatant by nature. We also have down here a willpower value, which is basically hit points. You start with willpower equal to the number of purple dots, and you can go up to the total number of circles you have when you are resting or healing, recovering from a fight or whatever. So we have Skeksil. We have Skek-Ung, the Gotham Master, who obviously he's still down at d6 on his speed. He is not as clever as the Chamberlain, but he is stronger. And has the same willpower. We then have Kira, who has speed d8, wit d8, but brawn d6. But she has more willpower. The Gelflings have greater reserves of will to endure what they have to endure. And we have Jen, who has speed d8, wit d10, and brawn d4. And again, 6 willpower. Starts with 5. Just like in the Labyrinth game before it, this game also includes a set of skill cards which your characters start with. Each character has a unique skill, and I say unique because the artwork and the name of the skill is unique, but they all basically do the same thing, and this is something that, I mean, it shows a limitation of the mechanisms of the game, I guess, in that they couldn't come up with more interesting skills than this. But the Chamberlain starts with Maddening Whimper, and I should say these are one-shot skills. You use them and then discard them and you never get them back. And if you are ever knocked out and you haven't used it, you lose it as well. But the Chamberlain gets Maddening Whimper, and at any point once per game he can discard the card to roll an extra d20 for a failed wit test. So you make your wit test as normal. If you fail it, you can discard this card and then roll a d20 to see how you do. And then we have Gotham Master, obviously for the Gotham Master, and this allows him to roll an extra d20 for a failed brawn test. And then we have Gelfling Pipe, which allows Jen to roll an extra d20 for a failed wit test. And finally we have Wings, which allows Kira to roll an extra d20 for a failed speed test. So you can see although they work on different skills, speed, wit, brawn, whatever, they're very straightforward in terms of what they actually do mechanically. Furthermore, Kira also gets Fizzgig. She will start with this Fizzgig token, and basically, while she has this token, her brawn increases to the next level up from what it currently is. So although she has a brawn of D6, while she has Fizzgig, it will be D8. If she is defeated and there's no other Gelflings around to take Fizzgig and look after him, he will scurry off and be lost for the rest of the game. And finally, one of the Skeksis will start with the Emperor token. How do you start with the Emperor token? Well, that is all dealt with during game setup. As you may have noticed by now, this game is absolutely beautiful, and for people who are big fans of the Dark Crystal, that may well be enough to want to purchase this game. And if you needed more evidence of the beauty of the game, just check out this game board. It's absolutely fantastic. It's one of those boards that you could spend a long time just looking at, and the more you look at it, the more little details you find. And yeah, it's just a really nice board. I can't quite get it all in shot, but if I move down slightly, you can see up here we have the Valley of Stones. There are spaces around the edge. On most spaces you draw an adventure card if you're a Gelfling, the exception being the moat here, which leads into the castle. The Gelflings are not immediately allowed to enter the castle. They are not allowed to do that until they have the sliver of the Dark Crystal. Inside the castle we have the slave quarters, which leads up to the banquet hall, and then the throne room, the crystal chamber, and then we have a prison, and then we have the Gotham nest down here. It's a wonderful board, very evocative of the theme, and one of the highlights of the game, much like the Labyrinth board was one of the highlights of the Labyrinth game. And much like the Labyrinth game, the Dark Crystal board game is a race against time. The Gelflings have a certain amount of time to find the shard of the Dark Crystal and return it to the Crystal Chamber. Time is measured with this really rather beautiful device. This is Augra's Orrery, and it starts at 19, and each turn it will tick down, and you can see over time we get the grand alignment until eventually we get all the way around. 3, 2, 1. Bad luck, Gelflings. Time is up. It's the end of the world as we know it. And this actually goes up to 23. So if you want to make it a little bit easier for the Gelflings, then you can allow more turns. And that's probably going to be a good thing if you're playing with the family and you've got some kids playing. And I think playing with the family is something that having the various factions in this game works quite well with. For example, you could have the parents controlling a Skeksis each, because then they're not able to team up on the kids, and then the kids can work together as the Gelflings, and then you can give them a little bit of extra time on the orrery. Or, you can have older siblings control the Skeksis, whilst younger players could perhaps work with mum or dad or whatever, playing the Gelflings. You can just mess around with the team structures so that the people who need help work in the cooperative team, whereas players who are a little bit more savvy with board games or whatever can work on the independent teams. But anyway, so we set the orrery to space 19, or whatever space we decide. We then have to give each of our players a character board, their special ability card, enough willpower for their starting willpower. Remember, these are actually like life tokens. If you run out, you get knocked out. And then everybody goes onto their starting spaces. Jen, not surprisingly, will start over in the Valley of Stones. Kira is wandering in the wilderness. A mean old Garthim is loitering, waiting to cause some trouble. The rest, it doesn't say it in the rules, but it does say it in the FAQ that the rest are assumed to be in the nest, which is here. And then you have to determine the starting location for your Skeksis, and that all depends on who the Emperor is, because at the very start of the game you have a trial by stone. just like in the movie. This is basically a straight up brawn test in that both players will roll the dice related to their brawn statistic, and you compare the results. The highest roll wins, except in the case of a tie, the Chamberlain will win. The winner becomes the Emperor. They get the Emperor token, and they get to sit in the throne room. And the loser loses a will point, so they immediately start the game wounded, and they start out here on the moat. At this point, we're almost ready to begin, except we have to create the world that the Gelflings will be exploring. Remember, they are looking for Aughra. So we have Aughra's Observatory. We set that card to one side. We then have a too small, really, deck of adventure cards. I would have liked to have seen more adventure cards that you pick a smaller subset of to play the game, so that there's more variety overall, because with this many cards, and you will see that the way that the card deck is set up, you will see most of the cards through the course of even your first game. So after a couple of games, you're going to have seen all the cards, and things are going to start feeling a little bit samey. Some more adventure cards wouldn't have killed them to have included an extra bunch, and then just, like I say, just pick a subset to play with. Because what you do is you set aside 6. You shuffle in the observatory into those 6. You shuffle the remaining cards, stick them on top, and that's your deck. So you have to work through this many cards to get down to this section, and then the observatory will be somewhere in the bottom 7 cards. These adventure cards, by the way, do different stuff, and anybody who has played Talisman will recognize the kind of thing. Like we have here the Swamp of the Black River, where it asks you to make a speed test. So you roll your speed dice, and somebody else rolls for the card, which is a d6. You do a comparison. If you equal or beat the roll of the challenge, then you win. It's a success, in which case it says leave this card on the space, so anybody subsequently coming and landing on that space will have to face that challenge as well. If you fail, you lose a will point, and if you're in a group, you're also waylaid, which basically means the Emperor gets to split you up and move you into adjacent spaces to make it more difficult for you to achieve your goals. While most of the adventure cards are tests that you need to test against in order to progress, threats, shall we say, there are a few slightly different cards in the deck that are a little bit more interesting. I thought I'd show you a few of those. The Great Plains. This one isn't more interesting. It's literally no effect. You leave it on this space, and it has a function whilst not having a function. The function is that you put it on the board, and it clogs that space for the rest of the game. It means that for the rest of the game, you have a safe space. So if you're not wanting to land on something that might potentially hurt you, if you can land on this space, you may not get to do anything. You may not be able to progress your adventure by drawing another adventure card, but at least you can sit there for a turn and know that you're not going to have to face anything horrific. We have Slave Podlings. This card is interesting because you get to choose what you're going to do. You can choose to avoid the podlings, in which case you test against speed, or you can confront them, in which case you test against brawn. In this case, they're rolling a d4 and a d6 and taking the highest as their result. And then other than that, it's just a regular test. This is probably the most interesting card. It's the Podling Village. You leave this card on the space, and if a Gelfling rests on this space, you roll a d6 and you get that many will points back. Normally when you rest, you would only get 1 will point back, unless if Gelflings rest at the Valley of Stones, they get all their hit points back, and if Skeksis rest in the throne room, they get all of their will points back. But when you're out and about in the wilderness and you rest, you normally only get 1. But the Podlings look after you at the village, but it's quite dark. If a Garthim or Skeksis ends its move here, and it defeats the Gelflings in combat if there are Gelflings on the space, or if there are no Gelflings there at all, you discard this card. So if Skeksis or Garthim land on this space and the Gelflings can't protect the Podlings, all the Podlings get destroyed. Landstriders. this is interesting. There's 2 cards like this. We have Landstriders and the Wall of Destiny. And they're interesting because they have different effects depending on whether it's Jen or Kira that finds them. Because if Jen finds the Landstriders, nothing happens. You just leave them on the space. But if Kira finds them, then she can take this card as a new special ability. And it says, Landstriders confer speed D12 to Kira and Jen if they move in a group. Kira can also discard this card to roll an extra D20 for a failed brawn or speed test. So that's interesting. And then we have the Wall of Destiny, which gives Jen a benefit rather than Kira. And Jen will get to keep this as a special ability card, and he can discard it at any point for a failed wit test. So there's a few cards that are a little bit more interesting, but generally speaking, there are tests. But with all that said, having created your adventure deck, you are ready to begin the game. And the game goes in turns, and each turn is always the same. First of all, the orrery is advanced by 1, except on the first turn of the game. Then the Chamberlain will take a turn, then Jen will take a turn, then the Gotham Master will take a turn, and then Kira will take a turn. And this will continue until a winning condition is met. The winning conditions being Jen or Kira getting the Crystal Shard to the Crystal Chamber, in which case the crystal is healed, or alternatively the timer running out before the Gelflings have had a chance to do that, in which case the current Emperor wins. The turn structure for characters is slightly different depending on whether they're a Gelfling or a Skeksis. The Gelflings will either rest or move. If they rest, they get will points back. 1 if they're out in the wilderness, all of them back if they're in the Valley of Stone, or D6 if they're at a Podling Village. The Skeksis have a choice of resting or moving as well, but before they do that, they draw a Minion card. And this is because whilst the Gelflings are hunting for the Shard to save the day, the Skeksis are hunting for the Gelfling. So there's a small deck of Minion cards. The Emperor will draw 2 and pick 1 to use. The non-Emperor will just pick 1 and do whatever it says. A lot of them are crystal bats. So you pick any world space. If Gelflings are there, the bats attack them with a D8 wit. If it's failed, then you discard the card. If it's a success, then you have spotted the Gelflings. And then what that means is you send the Garthim to their space and bad things start happening. Basically, one Garthim from anywhere on the board lands on the Gelfling and attacks, and it's a brawn test, which highlights another flaw in the rulebook in that it doesn't actually tell you what the stats are for a Garthim. It's actually they have brawn D12 and 1 will point. But yeah, that was omitted from the rules book, which was a little bit on the silly side. So yeah, we have crystal bats and crystal bats and crystal bats. And we have right, you just lose a will point, which is not great. We have feeding on slaves, which is nice. You roll a d20. On a result of 11 or higher, you recover a will point up to your maximum. So, and then obviously we have Garthim. Pick a Garthim anywhere, then roll a d4 and move it. If you land on the enemy, Skeksis or Gelflings, attack them immediately. But yeah, it's basically Garthim crystal bats. And that's the main thing that the Skeksis will be doing. They don't draw adventure cards. They draw a Minion card, they perform the action of the Minion card, then they will move or rest. And when they move, obviously they're trying to land on either the Gelflings to attack them, or they're attempting to land on the other Skeksis in order to defeat them and claim the title of Emperor. And that's basically how the game will progress. There are a few little details which are kind of thematic elements drawn from the movie. For example, Kira isn't allowed to enter the Valley of Stones unless she is with Jen. If she's travelling with Jen, he can guide her in, but otherwise she doesn't know where it is. But she will also wake up there if she is defeated by an encounter, an adventure card, while she's out in the wilderness. And that's an interesting thing to note about this game, is that where and how you are defeated actually has an impact on what happens to you. If you are defeated by an adventure card while you're out in the wilderness, then if you're a Gelfling, then you wake up in the Valley of Stones because the Uru find you and they heal you. And when you rest there, you get all of your wounds back. If you are defeated by the Gotham or the Skeksis, then you wake up in the prison, and then you can only get 1 will point back at a time, and when it's time to move, you have to actually break out of prison, which requires a test. For the Skeksis, if a Skeksis is knocked out, regardless of where they are, they wake up in the throne room. Healing in your designated safe space, either the throne room or the Valley of Stones, actually confers an additional benefit in that you get to tap into the advice of the people who are there. So the Gelflings resting at the Valley of Stones will get to draw a card from this deck. Check that icon out. This is a deck of Uru, and basically you get to take one of these cards and it will become an ability for you, and you can discard it at any point to use the values on the card instead. And again, if you're knocked out at some point, you will lose any of the cards that you have. And there is a similar deck for the Skeksis. If they heal in the throne room, then they get to talk to their allies, colleagues, cohorts, and you get to take one of these cards, which has the Scientist, the Ritual Master, the Slave Master, the Gourmand, the Treasurer, the Scroll Keeper, and the Ornamentalist. And again, you get to take one of these and you put it by your character sheet, and then it's a one-time use special ability. The interesting thing is, this is actually a way to improve your character, but anybody who has seen the film Dark Crystal knows that it's all about balance, it's all about yin and yang. So if at any point one team gets one of these cards, the other team immediately gets to draw one as well. And so the game continues until the Gelflings find the observatory. They have to complete a test at the observatory. If they do, they get to take the crystal. If at any point you get knocked out while you're carrying the crystal, if the other Gelfling is in your space, then you pass the crystal on. If there is no other Gelfling in your space, then you lose the crystal and it's game over. So at that point, you really want to be working together. Combats happen when characters land on enemies, and because Gelflings will fight Gotham and the Skeksis, and because the Skeksis will fight the Gelflings and each other, combat is quite frequent. And in fact, if you land on a space that has enemies, you have to resolve any combats before you can draw a world card if you are a Gelfling. And the combat can seem a little fiddly at first, because the Gelflings fight the Skeksis fight the Gelflings and each other. The Gotham side with whichever Skeksis is controlling them at the time. So it takes a little bit of time to figure it all out. But basically, if a Gelfling lands on a space that contains Skeksis or Gotham, all of the Skeksis and the Gotham will fight together against the Gelfling. If a Skeksis lands on the Gelfling, it will fight the Gelfling. If it lands on a space that has a Gelfling and the other Skeksis, then both the Skeksis will team up and fight against the Gelfling with the Gotham. And then if a Skeksis lands on another Skeksis, they will fight each other. The Gotham, it's possible to drag them along when you're playing as the Skeksis. If you land on Gotham, you can choose to move as a group, where you basically invite the Gotham to travel with you, and they will travel with you unless the other Skeksis player lands on you at some point and sort of steals them away. And the Emperor will get final say on where the Gotham go at certain times. So it's a little bit fiddly, but once you've done it a couple of times, it sort of makes sense. But because the factions are vying against each other and with some internal conflict as well, it takes a little bit of time to get your head around that. But so the game continues with the characters moving around the board, fighting each other, the Gelflings revealing adventure cards, the Skeksis trying to stall them at every opportunity. They even have a special ability called Waylaid, where if they defeat Gelflings using wit, rather than forcing the Gelfling to lose willpower, they can actually force them to move instead. You can't move them into dangerous things. If they move onto something like a card, the card doesn't activate, but you can actually break up the party, force them to move apart, which is important if one of them is carrying the crystal, because you want to defeat them separately in that case, so that they're not able to pass off the crystal and continue on their adventure. But at some point, they will probably have the crystal and they will enter the castle by using the moat here. They cannot enter the castle until that time. Once they're in the castle, the end game begins. And the end game is kind of weird because it changes things up a little bit. First of all, the Gelflings enter the slave quarters, which is here. If one Gelfling moves in there, the other Gelfling immediately teleports to join, like so. At the same time, both of the Skeksis teleport to the crystal chamber, like so. The Garthim will no longer play a part in the game, so you remove those from the board. And in an example of being super cheap, you have to take the standee bases off of your Garthim, because we now have some different standees. We have a standee for the Gourmand, who goes there. We have some slave podlings. They go there. And then we have the slave master, who goes there. And yes, it very much seems like we're going to be getting a set of miniatures to replace these stand-ups. I certainly hope so. At this point, there is no longer any movement as such. The Gelflings are just going to face a sequence of challenges, whilst the Skeksis fight each other. So, whenever a Gelfling takes a turn, they will face the current challenge. For example, in the slave quarters, they have to face the slave podlings. And again, it's just a series of tests. Against the slave podlings, it's a speed test against a D8. If they fail, they have to then do a brawn test where they have to fight the podlings. And if they succeed, they have to do a wit test against the podlings. And if they fail, they lose will points and stay where they are. If they succeed, you remove the standee and then they will advance to the next chamber. In the banquet hall, they face the Gourmand. They have a speed test first. If they fail, you have to draw 2 of the Skeksis cards. These cards here. You draw 2 of them and you have to fight them as a group. And if you pass, you only draw 1 of these cards. And then again, you go on, and in the throne room, you do a speed test against a D12. If you fail, you draw 3 Skeksis cards and fight them as a group. If you succeed, you only draw 2 cards and fight them as a group. If you complete that, you go into the crystal chamber and you fight any Skeksis that are still in the crystal chamber. If you defeat the Skeksis, then you win the game. And what the Skeksis are doing is every time it's one of their turns, they fight each other. And you kind of hope that by the time the Gelflings get to the crystal chamber, one of the Skeksis has been knocked out. And then that's it. That's the end of the game. So what do I think? Well, I don't think the game's that great. It's an improvement over Labyrinth. It's an improvement because it has the teams. It has certain players that are working cooperatively. It has certain players that are working against each other. It's an improvement because they've introduced the concept of persistent skills. When you rest at the Valley of the Stones or in the throne room, you get one of those cards, which means you have more opportunities to manipulate dice rolling. You do have there's always one way to manipulate dice rolling, in that if you fail a dice roll, you can actually spend a will point to take the test again, but rolling a d20 instead, and that's a mechanism lifted straight from Labyrinth. But those other skill cards that you have access to, they reduce the need to rely on those will points to retake those tests. So I like the fact that you can get those cards and you gain a persistent effect, even though it is a one-shot ability and then it's gone. Obviously, I think the game is beautiful. I think the miniatures are fantastic. I think the artwork is absolutely astounding. The board is a little masterpiece, but there's just not a lot here to get your teeth into. I mean, as a Gelfling player, you're basically going to try to avoid fighting the Skeksis as much as possible. So you are running away. In that sense, the game does recreate the feel of the movie in that the Gelflings are trying to run away whilst the Skeksis are hunting them down. But for the Gelfling player, you really are just moving left or right. If you land on a blank space, you draw one of these adventure cards. It's almost always a test, which is a dice roll. And like I say, there's a certain amount of dice mitigation by spending the will points or by using a skill. But you don't really gain anything. If you succeed, you often don't get anything other than you just don't take damage. And if you fail, then you take damage. And that's something that Talisman did that so much better, because when you win a fight, you got to keep the trophy, and then you could cash the trophies in to improve your character. And then there were cards that you could flip that were followers and spells and things like that, and new items. So you created your own narrative for your characters. Dark Crystal doesn't allow you to create your own narrative. It allows you to recreate the narrative from the movie, which is fine in its own regard, but it does mean that your gameplay is limited. There's not a huge amount of replayability because it's a small deck of adventure cards. You're going to see almost all of them in every game you play. You don't really get that many skills or things like that do interesting things. I mean, almost all of the skills are, retake your test with a slightly better dice than you rolled last time. So it's the thinness of the mechanisms don't allow for interesting concepts to be woven into the framework, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's always going to be, oh, you've got a new skill. It's basically roll a different dice. There's nothing that allows for a more interesting dynamic type of gameplay to emerge. It's move left or right, draw a card, roll a dice. For the Skeksis, you're trying to hunt down the Gelflings, and that's slightly more interesting because you get to do the maniacal laughter thing, and you get to go, ha ha ha, I'm coming to get you, and you roll the dice and you try and land on top of the Gelflings. And because you can manipulate your movement dice by choosing to roll a lower value dice than your actual speed value, you have a little bit of control over trying to land on top of them. So it's a slightly different dynamic. You lose the enjoyment of drawing from an adventure deck and having to confront your own challenges, but you become very proactive in creating the confrontation. So you get a very different feeling to how the Gelflings play, which is they're trying to avoid the fights, but they're also trying to whiz through that adventure deck as quickly as possible because they want to get to Aughra. So, and they know that Aughra is at the bottom of the stack, so they have to blitz through those cards really quickly. So they're just trying to rush around having their adventures and reacting to what's happening to them, whereas the Skeksis are being very proactive and malevolent. And that's quite interesting. And the minion thing is quite nice. You get to draw a minion card and you get to do something. It's usually, send a Garthim to go and have a go at one of the Gelflings or whatever. It feels a little bit mean-spirited, but then if you're playing a Skeksis, it should feel mean-spirited. That's the nature of the characters. I think the game has done a fantastic job of creating those thematic elements where, yes, it does feel like, you're a mean Skeksis hunting down these poor Gelflings, and the Gelflings are constantly under pressure and they're constantly running around trying to avoid those fights, and, it's a bit scary for them. So it works in that regard, but again, it's just, there's not a lot going on your turn. You roll a dice, you move left or right. If you land on a Gelfling, you can attack. If you're not the Emperor, you probably want to go and have a go at the Emperor if you get an opportunity to. You might want to try and land on some Garthim, because once you land on Garthim, you can take them with you. Although, if the other Skeksis comes along, they have an opportunity to take them away from you. But, you want to build a little army of Garthim to follow you around, because that makes you stronger, it makes you more powerful, and then you can seize the title of Emperor, and then That's what you need to make sure that you've got that Emperor title when you win the game, and that's a balancing act. You don't want to take it too early because, you know, you're painting a bullseye on your forehead, but you want to make sure you've got enough time to take it if you need to. But yeah, it's just there's not a lot going on. It's just move left or right, land on something, roll a dice, resolve the challenge, and then move on. It's beautifully presented, and it has some really interesting concepts that feel like they should be in a more elaborate game. And I do feel that something as elaborate as the Dark Crystal, such a beautiful monument to Jim Henson's vision, should be more elaborate. The Dark Crystal is a masterpiece. It's a beautiful piece of cinema, and whilst this is a beautiful game, it's hollow, it's shallow, and that's something that the Dark Crystal can't be accused of, because Dark Crystal has such depth and vision, and it took risks, and it was bold, and it was brilliant. And this is very safe, simple. I guess it achieves what it wants to achieve. It wants to be a family game, and they've kept things very simple because of that. But I can't help feeling like there should be more to it. There should be more going on. I mean, even Talisman, like I say, had the trading trophies to upgrade your character, and had the rings of the board where you could progress to the central ring, facing greater challenges but getting greater rewards. There's no decisions like that in this game. The board is a circle. You go left or right around the circle, and that's all there is to it. And as beautiful as it is, the standee thing is a bit of a bugbear. I don't like using standees and miniatures at the same time in a game. I think a game should be standees or miniatures, not both. And it certainly feels like we're going to get some expansion packs that introduce those miniatures, and I will absolutely buy them just because I want miniatures of these characters from this amazing film. But this is quite an expensive game, and I feel like maybe they could have included some more miniatures. These stand-ups for the final showdown are completely unnecessary. They literally stand on the board to show you whether or not you've completed the challenge, if you can't remember from one turn to the next whether you've completed the challenge or not, because you only take it away once you've done it. But they don't move around the board, they don't do anything. But yeah, it would be nice to have the miniatures. But I guess that's it. This video is incredibly long for a game that possibly doesn't deserve an incredibly long video, because it doesn't have enough going on. It's got the beginnings of interesting ideas. It's got things like being able to move together, but it means you have to move at the value of the lowest speed in your party. That's interesting. That's the beginnings of an interesting concept that could be expanded on into a more impressive game experience. This is very much a light family game, rainy Sunday afternoon. You can play it in under an hour. It's not going to outstay its welcome. It's only 19 turns on a standard game. So it's not going to get to the point where you're absolutely cheesed off with what's going on. But I think if it was much longer, you certainly would do, because you're going to be doing the same thing every turn. It's move, test, repeat. And that's a shame. A beautiful game, but a little bit hollow. And that's it from me. I don't think I have anything else to add. Hopefully, if you have found this little look at the Dark Crystal board game interesting. If you have any comments or queries, do leave them below. I've tried to cover as much as I can, but there's probably a few minor details and things that I've left out, but nothing major. I've given you most of the details here, but if you feel there's anything that you would like explained further, let me know. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.